could recite the First Amendment. What about the second? What about the third? And the 10th? So the 10th Amendment is pretty interesting. James Madison published this ratification on December 15th of 1791. This amendment says that the federal government is only has those powers specifically granted by the Constitution. For example, laws concerning drugs. Nowhere in the Constitution does it grant the federal government power to regulate drugs. From the language of the 10th Amendment, one can then conclude that this power is delegated to each state, such as the legalization of marijuana in Oregon back in 2015. Today, during our presentation, we're going to talk about how this amendment is not without its problems. Stephen is going to share some interesting information regarding your driver's license, Simon on some different protection laws in each state, and then Lauren and Adria are going to discuss perhaps the biggest challenge against the 10th Amendment, which was Roe versus Wade, the great debate over abortion laws. Stephen, what can you tell us about our driver's license?
Here in the United States, the West Coast makes up 15% of all licensed drivers. 26.2 million licensed drivers in California, 5.6 in Washington, 2.9 in Oregon. Most of us have gone through the same training, same stipulations. The average age to get licensed or begin the process is 15. With Washington having the only required training under the age of 18. In 2005, the Real ID Act was established by the Department of Homeland Security to quote-unquote combat national terrorism. Under this Real ID Act, there has been serious objection from most states, and to this day, there are still 23 states that are out of compliance, and Oregon is one of them. As of October 2018, our licenses will actually be invalid unless we get some ratification where we will not be able to travel, board airplanes. Our license will be invalid as a identification card. The 10th Amendment is actually getting blurred between the lines of the Real ID Act and what these states can regulate. There are also some people, some people that have chosen to opt for what they're calling the 10th Amendment driver's license, where they print out their own form, they input their own information, and they drive around like that, because there have been Supreme Court cases that if you take the text of that, you can interpret it to say that you actually don't need a state-regulated driver's license. Those same texts can be read either way. I don't recommend not driving without a driver's license. Just saying. Disclaimer. And then, let's see here, then I can switch. So from that I found to be a good example of how the 10th Amendment applies today, how the lines are being blurred, and gosh, what else? You had some good talking points. Yeah, and then, so speaking of blurring of the lines, I'm now going to switch to Simon, who's going to talk about self-defense laws.
Hello everybody, my name is Simon Turner. I'm here to discuss the self-defense laws that are covered in the 10th Amendment. It's kind of a tricky thing to say because I say that they're covered in the 10th Amendment, but the 10th Amendment leaves that up to the states themselves. There is one, however, law that is pretty consistent across the board. I'm not going to read the whole thing, just going to give you a quick summary of it. Basically is what it's saying, that any person is allowed to use physical force in a justified way to help another person in self-defense to defend themselves if they believe it to be like a serious crime that's going to cause imminent danger. And that's the one rule that's stated across the board, across all the states. All the other laws are pretty broken down and individual upon the legislators of that state. Gun laws can be one of the tricky ones. I went through and looked up gun laws in Oregon, seeing that's how we all live, and gun laws in New York, seeing that's a more populated state, and they have seen a lot of trauma due to 9/11. So their laws are a lot more strict than the ones in Oregon. In Oregon, they're allowed to use. Let me see. This is all freestyle. Must notify officer. Okay. One I'm gonna hit on is the fact that you don't have to notify officer. That blew my mind. That you don't have to notify officer that you have a loaded gun in your car. You do have to have all your paperwork on you, but you don't have to tell them that you have a gun on you. I thought that was pretty crazy. And another thing I want to point out is constitutional carry. I'm pretty sure a lot of people may not know what constitutional carry is. I didn't know what it was until I did the research on it. And constitutional carry is you carrying your weapon solely based off of the Second Amendment. Using no permits, using no state laws, no nothing. You use the Second Amendment and you carry your weapon based on that. And I'm not sure if any states does have constitutional carry. So we go on to the next one. Yeah. Yes, I think that would be.
So that's
Oh no! I need it. Damn it! I should have hit deadly weapon first before I hit the gun laws, because you can use a deadly weapon. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say you can use a deadly weapon in here, and then I'm gonna say one of the most known deadly weapon or most popular deadly weapon are the guns, and I'm gonna hit that, and then I'm hit the constitutional carry, and then I'll be done with that. I'm not sure how long that was.
And then introduce Lauren.
Okay. So there's my presentation on that. Next, I'm gonna hand over to Lauren so she could go over another part of the another part of the 10th Amendment?
Yeah.
Okay.
So interestingly enough, not only does the 10th Amendment affect our driver's license, our right to defend ourselves, but it affects one of the most controversial topics in our nation today, abortion. But before we get into that, we have to learn a little bit about block funding. Block funding is basically a large sum of money that is given to a state or territory, which are then allowed to spend the money however they choose. Some block grants have restrictions though. For example, the Social Services Block Grant can only be used to fund organizations and agencies that serve their communities in the area of social services. Now, on to one of the only federal regulations on abortion, the Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment was passed soon after Roe v. Wade, and it states that no federal funds may be used to cover abortions except in cases of rape, incest, or life endangerment. However, the Hyde Amendment is a temporary federal law, which means it must be renewed every congressional session. The federal law forbids states from spending federal funds, i.e. block funds, on abortion, but does not prohibit the states from using their own funds. So now that we know that the states only spend their own money on abortions, what are the differences between them? Let's start with Oregon, our home state. Oregon is basically anytime, anywhere, and any why. The only law in Oregon regarding abortion states that all abortions must be paid for using state funds, even if you are not a legal resident of Oregon. However, individuals and private institutions still have the right to refuse to participate. Now for the complete opposite of the spectrum, Oklahoma. Oklahoma all abortions must be performed in a hospital after a required 72-hour waiting period and must have a valid reason, i.e. rape, incest, or life endangerment. No public funds may be spent on abortions except in cases of rape, incest, or life endangerment, and private insurances do not have the right, cannot cover abortions except in cases of severe life endangerment, and parental consent is required for all minors. Now for a little bit more information, a state that's right down the middle, Florida. Florida can be any time before 24 weeks gestation, but it must be performed in a hospital, but it can be for any reason. Public funds only cover abortions in cases of rape, incest, or life endangerment, but private insurances may cover abortion for any reason. And in addition, parents do not need to be notified for minors. Now, for a little bit of the history of why this is so convoluted and why the differences are so big, Adria is going to talk about the Roe versus Wade case that overruled the 10th Amendment.
In 1970, a lady in her early 20s using the name Jane Roe to protect her privacy sought to terminate an unwanted pregnancy. Currently in Texas, the state of her residence, it was illegal to have an abortion. Jane Roe then decided to begin a federal attack on the District Attorney of Texas, Henry Wade. While most American women with financial means could obtain abortions by traveling to other countries where the procedures were safe and legal, or they could pay a large fee to a U.S. doctor willing to secretly perform an abortion. Those options were out of reach for Jane Roe and many other women. After finding out that Jane Roe was interested in challenging the abortion laws, she was directed to Texas attorneys Linda Coffey and Sarah Waddington. Roe and her attorneys ruled that the anti-abortion law Texas had was unconstitutional and violated the 14th Amendment that gave women the right to privacy, so they decided to take this case to court. Roe and her attorneys had a tough road ahead of them. According to the Constitution, no federal law could be mandated to the states unless explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. And since the Constitution did not state that the government had power to govern abortion laws, it would be tough to get the courts to agree on a federally mandated law to negate any ban of abortion a state might have. After much fighting and many court cases, the court held that the women's right to an abortion was implicit in the right to privacy protected by the 14th Amendment. So in June of 1970, a Texas district court ruled that the state's abortion ban was illegal because it violated constitutional right to privacy. But it wasn't until January. After much fighting in many court cases, the court held that the women's right to an abortion was implicit in the right to privacy protected by the 14th Amendment. So in June of 1970, a Texas district court ruled that the state's abortion ban was illegal because it violated constitutional right to privacy. But it wasn't until January 22nd, 1973, that the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, struck down the Texas law banning abortion, which was the beginning of effectively legalizing the procedure nationwide. Since Roe v. Wade, many states have come up with restrictions that weaken abortion's rights. But due to the federally mandated law, a state could not decide to ban abortions altogether. But other than this federal law, each state has been given the right to decide some abortion laws for themselves. All in all, what exactly is the purpose of the 10th Amendment?
The 10th Amendment, again, was put into place because of the great issue of power. The Founding Fathers, having come from Britain, which was a monarchy, were very afraid that too much power to the federal government would lead to corruption and eventually destruction of the United States. So it's quite clear in the 10th Amendment was written to emphasize the limited nature of the powers delegated to the federal government. In delegating to specific powers, the states and the people, with some small exceptions, were free to continue exercising their sovereign rights. When states and local communities take lead on policy, the people are that much closer to the policy makers, and policy makers are much more accountable to the people. Few Americans have spoken with their president, but many have spoken with their mayor, and that is the importance of the 10th Amendment. Now, to end on a happy note, we're going to share some of the weirdest state laws we found in our research. In Minnesota, a person may not cross state lines with a duck atop his or her head.
In Ohio, it is illegal to get a fish drunk.
In Oregon, it is illegal to test your physical endurance while driving on the highway.
In Iowa, anyone trying to pass margarine off as real butter is guilty of a misdemeanor. Renovated butter must be labeled as such.
And in Alabama, you wear a funny fake mustache in church, it's illegal.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yay.
Thunderous. And the house law.
And that took us about 15 minutes.
Yep.
That's perfect.
Exactly. Pretty much.
So we're looking good.
Yeah.